Thanks, church family. It's good to be back in Bonners Ferry, and it's fun to be surrounded by friends. I look here, and friends going back years and years from Pendleton, Oregon, and Camp Myvedin, and been up here with my wife speaking to you sometime back, and so it's good to be back with you here in Bonners Ferry. And I just want to say a couple things. I heard, Jeff, you talking about a letter from our conference president. If you haven't read that, I would just say, please do, and keep our leaders at the conference office in prayer. There's always reason for that. I think we're blessed with a president who is a man of prayer and faith and vision and determination, and all of those are going to be needed because just as things in the nation are in upheaval, there are major challenges facing the conference. And we would covet your prayers, and I know our leaders especially would. So I don't necessarily count myself. I get to work with people who work with kids, which is a great place to be in, and I want to talk to you about some of that this morning. But I also just want to say I've been blessed. I can't remember the last time that I visited a church and I was so blessed by the stories shared in the prayer time. And I just said, so who's taking the membership card to the dump this next week? Because clearly God has marked her to be a part of your family. So I hope someone will follow up on that and just say, you know what, we have a warm, loving family of people, and we'd love to have you be part of it. And let her grow into her new family. Seems like God has chosen her. I'd like to pray with you, and then I want to share. You've kind of already started my sermon for me, so I may jump ahead on some parts, but let's bow our heads one more time and pray. God, thank you for the rain that continues to fall. We ask for the rain of your Holy Spirit to be poured out as well on this community, and I hear the evidence that it is. And we think of another hymn, Showers of Blessing. Lord, we hear the pitter-pat, but we're waiting for the deluge of your Holy Spirit, and we ask that you would open our minds this morning as we think about how you have promised us this work would be finished in Bonners Ferry and the surrounding communities at this time in history. We ask that you would open our minds and convict our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm starting a timer because I have a hard time not going way over time on this. So this morning I'd like to talk to you about becoming trusted sources in a world of fake news. And I want to begin, we'll see if this is going to work here. I'm hitting my clicker, but nothing is happening up there. Aha, there we go. I just want to ask you a question, and the children's story tied right into this as well. And my question is for each of you individually and for you corporately as the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Bonners Ferry. And my question is this: why are you here? Why are you here? And we could ask, I didn't check the stats this morning, and I know, we can have a conversation at potluck about, how they count. But here we are, after 2 years of watching over 6 million people lose their lives around the globe to a sickness, right? And yet we're here. Why? Why are you here? Why am I here? My answer to that question began when I was 8.5 or 9 years old. My sister, who's 10 years older than me, had come home from Milo Adventist Academy for a home leave. And my dad and I had driven her back to Milo. How many of you have ever even been to Milo? Okay, I got a few. All right. One of the most beautiful places on earth in Southern Oregon there. And my family, my dad and I, my parents were divorced at this point. My dad and I were living just outside of Albany, Oregon. And so we got in our little Volkswagen Squareback, and we started south. And it's a long ways all the way down to Milo Academy from Albany. And we made the drive down, and then we turned around, and we were heading home, and it was late, and we were tired. In fact, those were the days before seatbelts were mandatory, right? And so I had laid down with my head in my dad's lap, no seatbelt on me, no seatbelt on him, and I had fallen asleep. And we were almost home. We were about 8 miles from home, late at night on a Sunday night on I-5, Interstate 5. We are northbound on Interstate 5 when it happened. my dad, who for much of his life has had a problem staying awake at the wheel, went to sleep northbound on Interstate 5, 55, 60. I don't know how fast he was going. It was a Volkswagen, so probably not very fast, right? And we'll say 60 miles an hour northbound. He falls asleep, and as he relaxes into sleep, the car begins to drift to the right. We're northbound, and the car begins. We heard this from people who saw it happen. They stopped, thankfully. And our car drifts over until it hits the shoulder, the gravel on the shoulder of the right-hand side of Interstate 5. And my dad, as soon as the tires hit gravel, he jerks awake, and the first thing he sees is a reflector coming at him at 60 miles an hour, and he does what any of us in this room would have done. He turns the wheel hard to the left to avoid the oncoming reflector. Well, what happened next was reported to us by a truck driver who watched it. The front tire, the front left tire, and then the front right tire as well, caught the pavement, and the car began to turn. But in that moment, the rear wheels lost all contact with the pavement and were only on gravel, and the rear of the car swung around 180 degrees. And when the rear wheel also hit the edge of the pavement, our car flipped up into the air, and turning in the air, flew across the two northbound lanes of I-5, across the left-hand shoulder, and landed on its wheels in the median between the north and southbound lanes of Interstate 5. The rear hatch had flown open, and somewhere in that process, Richie had flown out of the vehicle. I woke up laying on the white line of the left-hand side of the southbound lanes of Interstate 5. And I woke to the sound of a semi-truck jake brake as a semi-truck went right by my head. And I heard it hit the gas can that had also been thrown from our car. The next thing I heard was my dad kicking open the door and yelling, "Richie, Richie, where are you?" And I was now waking enough to make some smart remark for an 8.5 or 9-year-old, because this was the second vehicle accident my dad and I had been in 10 days' time. This one far more serious. My dad, who had stayed in the vehicle but without a seatbelt, had broken a couple little spines that were coming off the vertebrae of his neck, and so he got to wear one of these collars for the next, 6 or 8 weeks. I, on the other hand, I got a free ride in an ambulance, the first and only of my entire life, to the hospital, which was great because they served Jell-O in ER if you're a kid, and that was fantastic. And at the end of the evening, our pastor came to get me from emergency. We left my dad in the hospital overnight. I walked out of the hospital that night. I had no broken bones. I had only a few minor scrapes and a few sore places, as you can imagine. And I'd lost my glasses, which we found in the weeds the next day. And as I walked with my pastor, Pastor Sid Nelson, out of ER and out to his car, something grabbed hold of my young heart, and it transformed my life. Because that night, as I walked away from the hospital with only slight bruising and a few scratches, I realized my life has been spared for a purpose. There is some reason for me to be here, because there is no reason that I'm still here. Now, about 10 years later, I was working at Camp Mivenden, summer camp staff, and my dad got sent to bad driver school by the state of Oregon because it wasn't going better. I don't remember what he did this time, but anyway, there was enough infractions that he got sent to bad driver school. And my dad wrote me a letter. Now, kids, you don't know what that is, but it's something we used to do that involved a pen and paper, things you're not familiar with. But my dad wrote me a letter and actually sent a physical handwritten letter on paper to me at Camp Ivaden. And I remember exactly where I was. As I was about 19, 20, somewhere in there. I opened this letter on the dock down at the waterfront at the camp, and I'm reading this letter from my dad. And in the letter, my dad says, oh, by the way, I got sent to bad driver school. And it's not school to become a bad driver, it's school because you are a bad driver, just for the record. And one of the things I learned in bad driver school was the importance of a seatbelt, and that when someone is ejected from the vehicle in an accident, only 1 in 4 survive. Recently had that confirmed in St. Mary's by the head of the emergency nursing team there in St. Mary's. And I remember sitting on the dock, it was a sunny, warm day at camp, holding that letter in my hands, and once again, being reminded my life was spared for a purpose. Why are you here? Why? For what purpose has God delivered you? For what purpose has God put you in this place in St. Mary's, Idaho? I see how this is going to go. All right, I'm just going to keep walking down the aisle. Are you clicking it for me? Is that what happened last time? I have no control at all. There we go. Jesus had to think about this same question. Familiar story, familiar verse, and I'm not going to do it from memory. Would it be easier if I just said click for you guys? I'm good either way. If we can go one more time. There we go. Jesus, you know the story. Jesus walks into his hometown synagogue, and he stands up to read, and he chooses this passage from the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads this passage. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Why? Because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Jesus is beginning his ministry here on earth, and as he begins his ministry, he says clearly, he articulates by quoting from Isaiah, "This is why I am here." And I believe as followers of Jesus, we can look at this and say, here's our mission statement as well, right? To preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. This is going to be fun. We're just going to bond between the balcony and I here. I don't know why it's... Just talk to me. I'll talk to you. Perfect. I'm going to get rid of my little baton. There we go. Yep. Click it one more time, please. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. That's where he finished that out. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Next slide, please. So, several years ago, this guy happened to our country, and I had not really been paying attention to political news, but somewhere in 2016, I got kind of caught up, and I started really tuning in and paying attention, and shock of all shocks, this guy ended up being the president of the United States, and I was reminded as I drove into your valley this morning that I was in Trump country. Big banner told me that was the case, so that's good to know. My sister, who's a Democrat, told me, we were talking as I was driving, and she's like, oh yeah, they got a big sign there coming in. But something interesting happened. Click to the next slide, please. Something happened between the headlines of 2016 and the headlines of 2020, and I'm not talking about politics. Something happened to our heart and soul as a nation, and whether our feelings changed or were simply exposed, truth, it seems, faded to a distant memory. President Trump coined a term that maybe others had before, but I hadn't heard it. It hadn't made the national news like every single day. He coined a term, and he called it what? Fake news. Yeah. And somewhere along the line, that idea of fake news settled into us, I think somewhat regardless of our ideology and persuasion, and we went, yeah, it's all fake news, right? Next slide. 2020, by that time, we'd become a people of fake news, and so when the next headlines came out and Joe Biden had won, many people in America and many, many, many people in Bonners Ferry, Idaho said, I don't believe it. It's fake news. Next slide. So I just want to take a quick survey of you here this morning, and we're going to do it by hand. You will not be held to any of the things you say, but I do this everywhere I go. I've been doing it since last November at Pathfinder Adventure Leadership Retreat, and I'm gathering in my mind information. So this survey is you're answering the question, who do you distrust, right? So we're finding out what's true of us, right? The church in Bonners Ferry. Who do you distrust? Don't stand. Just raise your hand, right? Raise your hand if you distrust the following people. Click. I distrust the media. Raise your hand if you distrust the media. If your hand's not up, I'm not sure. You need to wake up, wake up, wake up. I'll yell, I'll talk louder. I distrust the government. You could hardly be in northern Idaho without that being true, right? So, I distrust the vaccine. Oh, now I'm meddling. Yeah, now some people have two hands up. I see you, yeah. I distrust politicians. Well, come on, if they're from Idaho, right? No, all right. How about this one? I distrust the economy. Well, that would only be true if you've been following the news at all. How about this? I distrust TV preachers. Oh, well, this is a good time for me to say that our speaker for camp meeting in a couple weeks is John Bradshaw, a TV speaker. Just saying. I distrust denominational leaders. I know. I don't want anybody to see me raise my hand. Hey, you know what? Technically, I'm a denominational leader, and I struggle sometimes, right? Thank you for clarifying where you stand. I feel so much better now. I love you too. Technically, I am one of those, and I struggle sometimes with that. Next slide. So here's where I'm going with this quick survey as we kind of chuckle and laugh, and the truth is we have a lot of distrust, right? And I just want to say to you, if you and I, who sit here today as the church of God in Bonners Ferry, if we are filled with this much distrust ourselves, where do you think our neighbors find themselves? Especially if we happen to live in or near Bonners Ferry, Idaho, which some have told me is the prepping capital of the United States of America. And they made their case to back it up, by the way. So we find ourselves as a community of faith struggling with trust, and we live in a culture that is likely struggling even more so than we are. We're people who've read the book. We know how it ends. Our neighbors may or may not have that assurance. Click the slide, please. We live in a time when truth has become tribal. Somebody raised my hand the first time I gave this message and said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, when truth becomes tribal, it means that I select truth and I listen to sources of truth based on what? Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a great way to say, if you say what I think is true, I'm pretty sure you're right. Right? Right? So next, click again. So how do people decide? Just like that, right? If I tune in to a radio station or a website or a YouTube channel or wherever you may find your information, might even be information about the church. If what they are saying disagrees directly with what I believe, what do? I tune out, right? I tune out. Now, if it agrees with what I think is probably true, and maybe then some, I tune in. So what I'm trying to point out to all of us is that we live in a time when people are selecting and receiving news or information based on how they feel about the source, right? So we tune in to trusted sources. Click. So the question then is, how do we gain trust? You think about the history of the Adventist church. We have been a people of truth since we were founded. But the culture, when the Adventist church was founded, was a culture of curiosity about what is true, right? And so the way Adventist evangelists back in the days of the Sawdust Trail would do it, they'd go into town and they had different things they would do. They would ask a question like, who's the most honest man in town? And then they'd go say, hey, I have some truth I want to share with you. And because truth was what everyone wanted to hear, they'd say, tell me more. And then that person would talk to their friends, and their friends would say, well, he's the most honest man in town, and it would grow, right? Today, if you wanted to clear a room in many parts of the country, if you wanted to have space all to yourself or even empty the aisle on an airplane, you could simply raise your voice to a loud level and declare, I have some truth I'd like to share with you. Right? Why? Because we're living in the age of fake news. So how do we gain trust? How do we, as Seventh-day Adventists, and you all were describing it in the praise time this morning, so you kind of gave away the whole message. Thanks for that. How do we gain the trust of our neighbors, right? How do we do that? I want you to take a look with me. So let me tell you a story here, and then we'll read this 3 paragraphs from Ministry of Healing, page 143. When I was in the seminary, all of us were required to memorize 1 paragraph from Ministry of Healing, page 143. Now, school comes fairly easily to me, but I'm also a lazy student, which means I don't do anything beyond what's assigned, right? And so I memorized that paragraph because I was assigned to memorize that. I don't know if I even read the paragraph before or after until a couple years ago when God started opening my eyes and some friends of mine around me to something that he had in mind. So the question is, what does the world need? And by the way, the pictures you're about to see, pretty much every picture I've got, I think from here on, has been taken here in Upper Columbia Territory in the last 2.5 years. Okay, so these are all fresh, current. This is from the community of Malden, Washington. Malden burned to the ground on Labor Day of 2020. And this family is standing in the burnt out wreckage of their home. The cruel irony of wildfires is what you see in the image. Nothing left of their home. And right across the road, homes that are basically untouched. So what does the world need? I'm going to read from back here because I'm having a hard time reading that small print. The world needs today, this is Ministry of Healing 143, the world needs today what it needed 1900 years ago, a revelation of Christ, period. A great work of reform is demanded, and it is only through the grace of Christ that the work of restoration, physical, mental, and spiritual, heard that from Wayne in Sabbath school today, I think it was Wayne, can be accomplished. Next slide. Christ's method alone. This is the paragraph we had to memorize. Christ's method how? Alone. This is the only way. Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching the people. What did he do? The Savior mingled with men as one who desired their good. He showed his sympathy for them, ministered to their needs, and what? Won their confidence. Then he bade them follow me. Now, I don't know, but if you listen to all the stories that came from around the sanctuary this morning about our friend down at the sanitary landfill, sounds like these steps are happening, right? That was super exciting to me. But I will say, I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and I've watched our church both as a pastor and not for a lot of years. And for many, many years, and in many places still today, we give ourselves a pass when we look at this list, right? Because we look at this list and we say, whoo, mingling, that's risky, isn't it? I mean, hanging out with people out there, that's kind of scary and messy, potentially. Showing sympathy, ministering to their needs, winning their confidence, that all takes a lot of time. We don't have much time. Time is short. And so we give ourselves a pass and we go straight to the last one and we focus all of our energy on he bade them follow me, and just said, we got to give the message over and over and over, whatever that looks like. Typically it involves a handbill with lots of beasts, right? And we skip those steps beforehand. Next slide. So what does the world need? Oh, this is the third paragraph. Here she finishes out this thought. She says, there is need of coming close to the people by what? Personal effort. That means we actually have to have a relationship with them, contact with them. If less time were given to sermonize, every time I read this, I just wish she wouldn't have left that part out. If less time were given to sermonizing and more time were spent in personal ministry, greater results would be seen. I had a church in our conference invite me up a few months ago, little tiny church, tiny community in Northeast Washington. And I met with them one evening. I think 5 people showed up, and they said, we really want to reach the kids in our community. And I'm looking at them and I'm going, really? You guys want to reach the kids in your... I'm telling you what I was thinking. I didn't say this to them, right? And so I'm listening. I said, well, tell me what you're doing. And they start telling me these stories, and it's amazing. This little tiny church, they run 2 vacation Bible schools a year, one in the summer, one in the winter. They've got a ton of kids. I didn't even know there's that many kids in town. Like, all the kids in town know that when the Adventists do VBS, you want to be there. It's going to be good. It's going to be fun. And then they started talking about all these different things they're doing. They opened their church on Halloween, and people actually came to the Adventist church. It blew my mind. And then they looked at me, and their faces kind of got long and sad, and they said, but everything we're doing, nobody has asked to join our church. Nobody has asked for Bible studies. And I said, but you're so close. They said, what? What do we do? What do we do? I said, well, you keep doing all the things you're doing, but you do more until you know their names and they know yours, and you become their friends, and then they'll start coming to your church and asking you why you believe the things you believe. And they went, like this. Why? Well, because they live in a place that's a lot like Bonner's Ferry. And they said, none of us live in this town. We all live out in the hills. We drive in. It's 45 minutes or an hour or more each way for us. And I said, well, there is one option. I said, you may want to throw me out when I say this. But I said, look, and I'm going to this quote right here. I said, look, what if you spent less time preparing for church on Sabbath morning? I said, just maybe for a year. Try it for a year. Spent less time preparing for church and more time figuring out how to connect with your neighbors. And one guy got this big, beautiful smile. Yeah, he's like, yes. And the others are like, I don't know if I like him. But it came from right here, right? If less time were given to sermonizing and more time were spent in personal ministry, greater results would be seen. The poor are to be relieved, the sick cared for. Does this sound like Isaiah? The sick cared for, the sorrowing and bereaved comforted, the ignorant instructed, the inexperienced counseled. We are to weep with those that weep and rejoice with those that rejoice. Now listen to this. Accompanied by the power of persuasion, the power of prayer, the power of the love of God, this work cannot be without fruit. Now, I don't know how you guys read in northern Idaho, but where I come from, that's a promise, right? You can take that to the bank. This right here, Christ's method, this method, she says, cannot be without fruit, right? This is encouraging. Next slide, please. So how do we unpack this? How do we unpack these elements of Christ's method? We're going to go through that, and I'm going to talk fast, and we're going to track through it. Look, it begins with Christ mingled with men as one who desired their good. How's that look? It starts with learning their names, right? You know her name at the dump. Right now, everybody in here knows. So I hope this next week she's like, what is going on with all these people bringing like one little bag of trash and calling me by name? What's up with that? Learn their names. This is Malden, Washington. So let me back up for a moment. My boys are Pathfinders in a club in Spangle, right? We live near Spangle. And that fall or August or so of 2020, we had our little Pathfinder Club staff meeting, and I'm serving as a counselor. So I'm the director for the conference, but I'm also a boys counselor in my boys club. And we sat down with our staff group, and we looked at each other, and you think about what was going on in August of 2020, right? And we said, this just doesn't seem like the time to run Pathfinders as normal. And as we talked, I think there was 3 or 4 of us there that day, we made the decision that for that Pathfinder year, which is basically a school year, that in our club there in Spangle, every week that we met, we would either serve our community, train to serve our community, or if we couldn't find a way to serve our community or train to serve our community, we would do Pathfinder honors and the kind of stuff that we're used to thinking about when we think of Pathfinders. Well, a few days later, Malden burned to the ground. Malden's about 25 minutes from our church in Spangle. And the Pathfinder staff looked at each other and went, that looks like an opportunity to serve. And so we started making phone calls. Who's in charge? Who's in charge in Malden, Washington? And what we found out was that Mayor Chris and Miss Jenna, she's in the Burgundy there. Miss Jenna was the town clerk on the day of the fire. They were in charge. And so I called Miss Jenna and said, hey, my name's Richie. I'm with an organization for kids called Pathfinders. She went, who? I get that a lot, but not anymore. That's changing. And I said, we'd like to bring our club down to your community and just see what we can do to help. So 10 days after the fire, Pathfinders were on the ground in the park in Malden, Washington, and we're walking. We get out of the car and we start walking, and there's ash everywhere. Every step you take, poof, poof, it's just poofing up. Our shoes instantly covered in soot. And as we walk through this burnt-out park, you can see the black burnt grass there and the kids walking through. She walks us over to this sign that says Malden Community Park, and there's a little cement block raised flower beds, probably 3 feet by 6 feet or so at the foot of this sign, and the plants have been burnt and the shrubs are charred, and even one leg of the sign has been burnt off a little bit. And she points right there. I caught it with the camera. She says, could you fix this? And I looked at her and I said, all right, let me explain how this works. I said, when we come, there will be hundreds of us. Think bigger. And her eyes went, whoop, as she began to think bigger. That was just after Labor Day. The next spring, 225 Pathfinders rolled into Malden on one afternoon. And in one day, we totally dug out and replanted that flower bed, left it looking beautiful. We gave gift bags to every person in Malden and Pine City, regardless of what they were living in, RV, house, whatever they had. We knocked on their door and gave them a gift bag. Granola, Blazing Grains granola, named by Pathfinders. And we gave them literature and just said, God loves you and we care. We gave away lawnmowers to people who lost their lawnmowers in the fire. We gave away bedding plants. We gave away raised bed, garden beds, and left an incredible impact on that community. Next slide. So let me ask you a little bit about your community. Just start clicking here. So let me just ask you, do you know these characters by name? And if you're not from here, think about the community where you live. Just raise your hand. How many of you know the mayor by name? I don't know. Is the mayor sitting in here this morning? No? Okay. How many of you know your town clerk by name? Okay. All right. I see the same hands going up. How about your postal clerk? Oh, okay. Mine's name's Stephen. He loves certain political news sources. How about your librarians? You know your librarians by name? This corner back here. Okay, a few of you go to the library. How about your bank teller? Do you know your bank? Thank you. Okay, got a few. All right. How about the pastor of, let's see, in your community, you have 2 churches that are Mennonite, right? 2? How many of you know the pastors of the Mennonite churches in town? Perfect. All right. How many of you know town council members in town? Okay. And how about the leaders, principals and other leaders of your public schools? A few. Okay. All right. All right. By the way, that's what the flower bed looked like after Pathfinders got done with it. A huge improvement. The next step we take is to show them that we care. You guys are doing that through your thrift store, right? This is how we do it. We do it by connecting in ways and meeting their needs. I live near a town, little tiny rural town out on the Palouse, that years and years ago, 2 physician couples left Loma Linda University after getting their medical degrees and came to Fairfield, Washington. And there they started their practice, and they spent their entire lives serving that community and the surrounding people. In fact, if you were to come to where I live and knock on the doors of farmers' homes and say, who delivered you when you were born? If they're my age or older, they would say Dr. Hart or Dr. Thiel. Dr. Thiel. Both of the Thiels were physicians. But last fall, my wife and I and a friend, we went to an estate sale not too far from our house, just on the edge of the community there. And somehow, as we were going through the estate sale, the people running it found out we were Seventh-day Adventists, and they said, "Oh, you know what? I grew up in this town," and they told us this beautiful story about community impact, showing people we care. Doctors Thiel and Thiel, they had a home. It was kind of up on a ridge just on the edge of town, I guess the fancy part of town at that time, and they had a swimming pool. And what they had, in addition to a swimming pool, was a flagpole. And our neighbor told us, when I was a kid, all the kids in Fairfield knew that if the flag was up the pole at the Thiel house, that meant the pool was open. These are Seventh-day Adventist people connecting to their community, caring for their community, inviting their neighbor kids to come be a part of their family and their neighborhood. I heard stories here today about couches being shared. Our little church in Fairfield, last year they planted a garden and they put a poster out, a banner along the highway and said, "Come garden with us." And I checked, both at town hall, because I do know my town clerk and my mayor. I checked at town hall and I listened to the people in the church. I don't think anybody from the community came to garden with them. But as the summer wore on, they started having all this produce, and they said, "What are we going to do with this abundance?" Well, in Fairfield, we have a tradition. There is, on Main Street, which is 2 blocks, there is the post office and town hall. The doors are maybe 10 feet apart, and between the two, there's a park bench. And as people's gardens begin to produce, if they have extra, they bring it and they put it on the park bench. And anyone in town who's coming to the post office or town hall, if they need produce, they take what they need, no questions asked. And so the Adventists began to pull up and unload boxes and boxes of beautiful produce, and it caught the community's attention. In fact, it made it onto the community Facebook group. People say, "Look at this gorgeous produce from the Seventh-day Adventist Church." And they got a lot of positive response. Not that people wanted to garden with them, but that people appreciated their contribution. We can show up when there's loss in our community. It might be a fire, might be a death in the family, might be any one of a number of things, but we can show up and say, "Hey, we care, we're here to help." Next slide, please. Click. Discover and meet the needs they see. You know, one of the things we do, it's human nature, right? We take a look at ourselves as a group and we say, what can we give them, right? And then we follow that, or maybe we lead with, what do they need? And we assess our neighbors and say, well, clearly they need X, depression recovery, smoking cessation, diabetes, whatever, all those things, right? And so we offer them and say, hey, we know you've got this need. Come on over to our place and we'll take care of you, right? But there's a huge difference, and I know this from personal experience because as a pastor, I worked really hard to try to connect to my community. I could never figure it out. But we started learning some things in Malden when we rolled in there and said, what do you need? And they started telling us, we need this, we need this. And every time the county would call, or the community of Malden, or the mayor, or the mayor's secretary would call and say, could Pathfinders do this? We said yes, yes, yes. Every time we said yes. Discover the needs that they see and meet those. And then the community begins to see you as a partner. You know what's happening now? It's not even 2 years since Malden burned. And now I get regular phone calls and emails from the community of Malden, from the community of Fairfield, and now more and more little towns across the Palouse are reaching out and saying, could Pathfinders come and help us with this, or this, or this? Because we've said yes to be a part of their community. I was in the community last Monday for Memorial Day with my boys, and there was a Memorial Day celebration, and this is a small community that we have a Seventh-day Adventist church in. And I was looking eagerly around through the crowd to see anyone from the Seventh-day Adventist church. And I had a dog in the hunt because I'd preached in their church not so long ago, and I'd encouraged them that while some things the community did were on Sabbath, and they may or may not feel comfortable joining that, Memorial Day is always on Monday. And I said, come on, come be a part of it. And I'm looking through the crowd for any everybody. I see people from the Valley Adventist Church, and I see people from another nearby Adventist church, but not one person from this Seventh-day Adventist church in that town showed up. But a few days later, they posted on the community Facebook page and said, hey, come help us as we do this thing at our place. Discover the needs they see. Next slide, please. Win their confidence as trusted community partners. You know what happened on the way home from Malden a year and a half ago, coming up on 2 years? The kids were in multiple cars. We're heading back to Spangle from Malden, and they had an assignment. My car, we didn't do the homework. We were talking about astronomy and other big ideas. But the other cars, they stayed on task. And when we got back to our meeting place there at the elementary school, our club director met me as I walked into the building. We were wrapping up our Pathfinder Club meeting, and she had this deer in the headlights look on her face. She's like, do you know what the kids want to do? I'm like, no. She said, so we had this conversation in our cars on the way back, and the kids these are Pathfinder age kids, right? The kids started asking the question, what's going to make young families want to move to Malden? How are they ever going to attract families with kids again in that little community? What's going to make Malden grow back? The kids are asking these questions, and the kids came to a conclusion, and their solution was, we need to give Malden a park. How many of you ever built a park before? Me neither. And neither had anybody on our team. And we had a decision to make. And adults, I just want you to tune in for just a moment. Too often, we tell the kids in our churches, hey, we got this thing, and we really feel good about ourselves when we invite them to help. But almost never do we ask the kids in our churches, what would you like to do for the community? And we go with them. But in this case, we made the decision, all right, let's give Malden, Washington a park. I could take the rest of the day until supper time telling you all the things that God did, but I will say that a year after the fire, not even a year, Pathfinders presented to the town council professional drawings, option A and B, of a brand new park to replace the one that had been burnt. All she asked us to do is that flower bed. And we had we had companies that cover the entire state of Washington backing us and saying, we'll do everything you need for free. That's how we got the professional drawings. We had unbelievable stuff happen. And there will be a new park. I don't think it's going to look anything like what we designed, but it's okay. We got the impetus to get that rolling. We won their confidence as trusted community partners to the point that last Labor Day, a year after the fire, Pathfinders came from all over Upper Columbia Conference to raise a new American flag over Malden. You'll see a picture from the cover of the Spokesman Review, actually, here in a moment. On the day of the fire, 80% of the structures in Malden were destroyed. Two things survived that were just iconic. One was an American flag, and the other was a little white community church. The community church, the fire burned right to the foundation. It was so hot at the base of the wall that the vinyl siding literally melted and ran down the wall, but the church did not ignite. The second, even more remarkable, was an American flag set on a pole. It was probably only 15 feet tall. It was right next to the community garage, I guess, basically their shop for the community, and some trees. So there's building here. This building burned completely to the ground, nothing left. The trees are all scorched all around the flagpole, and the American flag survived. There's no explanation. So we were meeting, our club director and I were meeting with the mayor down in Malden one day, and I said, by the way, that flag, is that the flag that survived the fire? And they said, oh yeah. I said, can we donate a new flag? That's part of your history. That should be put in a safe and honored place. That's part of your story. And they were like, long story short, last Labor Day, 1 year after the fire, Pathfinders gathered from all over the conference and lowered the flag that had survived the fire a year before and raised a new one, donated by Pathfinders, becoming a trusted community partner. That same day before we left, the mayor's secretary, the town clerk now, her name's Mickey, she said to me, I have an idea. Now I've learned when Mickey has an idea, that's trouble for me. She said, I'd like to create a monument to commemorate the fire. Do you think Pathfinders could do that? And I went, yeah, that's probably in our wheelhouse. And like I said, I can keep you till supper, and I won't. Next slide, please. There they are, Pathfinders lowering the old flag. You can see it's tattered there. Adventurers came from literally all over the conference. Next slide. Share, now we're going through these steps, right? Ministry of Healing 143. Then share with your what? Friends, the one who gives you hope and prompts you to serve. This is the beauty of what's happening at the dump in Bonners Ferry, right? You're making a friend. I used to work for a company that does evangelism marketing for Seventh-day Adventist churches, right? So when you plan a meeting, those handbills have to come from somewhere. And I was the person who helped churches design their handbill, make sure they got mailed to the right zip codes in the right time. And here's what we've learned. There's a lot of research behind evangelism marketing, and what we've learned is it's basically a numbers game. If you mail out X number of pieces in the mail, you will get X number of responses. You can bank on it. The only things that change that would be the income of the zip code you're mailing to. If the income is lower, your numbers will go up a little bit. But it's typically about 2% response, right? Now, what changes everything as far as response is if the person being contacted has a relationship with the person who's inviting them. Changes everything. Next slide. We need to see more than tribe. This is from Desire of Ages. In his contact with men, he, Jesus, did not ask, "What is your creed? To what church do you belong?" He exercised his helping power in behalf of all who needed help. Instead of secluding himself in the beautiful mountains of, northern Idaho, instead of secluding himself in a hermit's cell in order to show his heavenly character, he labored earnestly for humanity. Next slide. So what's your legacy here in Bonners Ferry? If I were to go into the community and just start knocking, and typically where I like to go when I'm asking the community what they know about an Adventist church, I like to start at the bar, right? Just walk in. I've done this. Churches that I was starting to pastor, I just walk into the tavern not far from the Adventist church and say, "Hey, I see there's an Adventist church down the road. Tell me what you know," right? Now, where I live today, I didn't even have to ask. When my family and I moved out onto the Palouse, we started meeting our neighbors, many of whom are Christian, and many of whom listened to what is now called Shine 104.9, broadcasting from the conference office. And for years, 13 years, I believe, to be exact, I have been Chaplain Richie on Shine 104.9. And when they would meet me, they'd go, "Oh, wait, you're Richie Brower? Like Chaplain Richie Brower?" And so that kind of gave us an in with our neighbors because they thought that was super cool. And I thought that was really cool too until one day I was visiting with one of our neighbors. Her husband was the superintendent of schools for the public school down the road. And she said, "So wait, is that radio station, is that a Seventh-day Adventist radio station?" I said, "Yeah, that's operated by the Seventh-day Adventist Church." She's like, "We know you Adventists. You kind of keep to yourselves." And I went, "Oh, well, it's true, right? You think about it. We have our own school out there, right? Our kids only go to our school. That's shifting, but pretty much for years they'd go to the church school. We have our own churches. And because of our Sabbath habits and most of the community events are on Sabbath, we don't mingle. And so our neighbors had come to believe, we know you Adventists. You pretty much keep to yourselves." And I said to myself, well, the Brower family is going to do what we can to change that. And that has meant that last summer, when our little community started having movie night in the park, and it was a Monday night or whatever night it was, the mayor of our community sat on the Brower blanket and watched the movie with our family because we've been building relationships for years now. The legacy in my little community is this. You see the sign, Thiel Park? That's our little community. And there are two parks in our community, Thiel and Hart Parks, named after Dr. and Dr. Thiel and Dr. Hart, their partner, who served their entire careers in that little tiny town. Next, click. I already did that, click. There's the cover of the Spokesman Review. They didn't say a word about Pathfinders, which I actually kind of like. I would love if we became the people who keep making the cover of the newspaper all across our conference without any mention till the point that our community starts saying, who are those kids in uniform? Next slide. What does it look like to be a trusted source in our communities? It means that we participate in our communities. On Memorial Day, many communities celebrate those who have served. And this is a group of Pathfinders, including two of my boys, who showed up and served as an honor guard in the blazing sun on a hot Memorial Day to honor veterans as they were recognized for their service. Next slide. Back to where we began, Malden, Washington in the background. Jesus said, "For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me." Ellen White said, Christ's method alone will bring true success in reaching the people. We can do this. You are doing this. But could we do it to the point where when the name Seventh-day Adventist is used in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, people would say, oh, we know them. Those people make a huge difference here. A year ago, and a couple of weeks ago now, a year and a couple of weeks ago, Pathfinders went into the community of Malden. And as I told you, they knocked on every door that was still there. And when they came back, staff started coming up to me saying, Richie, you won't believe what happened. Our kids are in their field uniforms, so that's t-shirts, not the scarf and all that. They said, everywhere we went, people threw the doors open and went, oh, it's the Pathfinders. They were so excited to see us. Let me just ask you, how many of you have done door-to-door work, in gathering or otherwise, have had people throw the door open and say, it's the Adventists? Why did that happen in Malden, Washington? First of all, kids get preferential treatment, okay? People don't expect kids these days to say, hey, we want to help. And when our kids do, people take note. Secondly, we'd been pouring into that community for months and months and months, to the point that the community sent out notice to all the residents and said, the Pathfinders will be coming. And when we showed up, it's the Pathfinders. That's my desire for every Seventh-day Adventist church in our conference. It's my desire for you in Bonners Ferry.